An antique painting leads a millionaire to his missing daughter after 20 years. You won't believe the truth. The room was silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of an antique clock, each sound echoing like a heartbeat through the cavernous space. William sat in his leather armchair, his gaze fixed on the painting in front of him. His trembling hands clutched a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid reflecting the dim glow of a nearby lamp. He wasn't a man easily moved, but tonight was different. The painting stared back at him, haunting in its familiarity. A young woman stood in the portrait, her gaze distant yet piercing, as though she carried the weight of unspoken truths. Her features, those high cheekbones, almond-shaped eyes, and the slight curl of her lips were a mirror of his late wife. The resemblance was undeniable, and for the first time in 20 years, a flicker of hope ignited in William's chest. He downed the whiskey in one swift motion, the burn in his throat matching the ache in his heart. Memories flooded his mind. His wife's laughter, his daughter's small hand in his, and the moment everything shattered. He closed his eyes, but the image of the painting was seared into his thoughts. Who was this woman? How could a stranger bear such an uncanny resemblance to the family he had lost? The sound of footsteps broke his reverie. His trusted butler entered, hesitant yet aware of his employer's troubled state. "Sir, it's late. Should I prepare your room?" William waved him off. "Not yet. I need to know where this painting came from." The butler hesitated. "Shall I contact the gallery, sir? Perhaps they have more information." "Yes." "Do it first thing in the morning," William commanded. His tone was sharp, but his eyes betrayed desperation. As the butler left, William leaned forward, examining the painting with newfound intensity. He noticed a faint signature in the corner. Michael. It wasn't a name he recognized, but it would be his starting point. He traced the lines of the woman's face with his eyes, his mind racing. 20 years. It had been 20 long years since the accident. The car crash that took his wife's life and left him broken. His daughter, Lily, had vanished that same night. Search parties combed through forests and rivers, but there was no trace of her. People whispered that she was gone, that he should move on, but William couldn't. The absence of her small body meant there was still hope, no matter how faint. Now, staring at this painting, that hope flared into something dangerous, something he hadn't felt in years. He reached for his phone and dialed the gallery owner, ignoring the late hour. A groggy voice answered. "Hello, this is William. I need to know everything about the painting I purchased today." The gallery owner hesitated. "Mr. William, it's almost midnight." "I don't care what time it is," William interrupted. "Who is Michael? Where did he find his subject?" There was a pause before the owner spoke again. "Michael is a young artist, quite talented. He mentioned that the woman in the painting was someone he met in passing, said she carried a photo of herself as a child, and it inspired the portrait." William's breath caught. A photo? Did he say anything else? Anything at all? Only that she lives in a small town. He didn't give specifics. William clenched his fist, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Get me his contact information. I need to speak to him directly." The gallery owner reluctantly agreed, and William ended the call. He placed the phone down, his mind whirling. If this woman truly was connected to his past, he had to know. Tomorrow, he would begin his search, no matter where it led. As the night stretched on, William sat in front of the painting, his thoughts a whirlwind of memories and possibilities. The girl he had once held in his arms, the child who had laughed and played in their garden, could still be out there. And if she was, he would find her. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows of William's study, casting long shadows on the floor. He hadn't slept. The painting sat on an easel near his desk, its presence an unrelenting reminder of the question that had tormented him all night. Could this be Lily? Could she still be alive? The butler entered quietly, carrying a tray with a steaming cup of coffee. "Sir, the gallery owner sent the artist's contact information as you requested." William took the note without a word, his mind already racing. He picked up his phone and dialed the number, each ring echoing in his ears like the countdown to a revelation. A youthful, slightly hesitant voice answered. "Hello? This is William. I own the painting you recently sold through the gallery. I need to speak with you about the woman you painted." There was a pause, then a cautious response. Yes, I remember. Her name is Rose. Why do you ask?" William's heart skipped a beat. "Rose," he repeated, letting the name settle on his tongue. "I need to know where you met her." Michael hesitated. "Look, I don't want to invade her privacy. She's been through a lot." "This isn't about curiosity," William interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "Or this is personal. I believe she might be someone very important to me." Another pause, longer this time. "We met in a small coastal town," Michael admitted reluctantly. "She's a teacher there. She carries a photograph of herself as a little girl. That's what inspired the painting." William leaned back in his chair, gripping the phone tightly. "Did she ever mention where she came from?" "No, she didn't. She said she doesn't remember much about her past. Just bits and pieces. Fragments, really. Fragments." The word hit William like a hammer. His Lily had been a bright, vivacious child, full of life and laughter. The thought of her wandering through life with no memory of who she was filled him with both sorrow and determination. "Thank you," William said, his voice softer now. "You've been a great help." He hung up and immediately began making preparations. By midday, his private jet was ready to take him to the town Michael had mentioned. As the plane ascended into the clouds, William stared out of the window, his mind replaying every moment of that fateful night 20 years ago. The sound of crunching metal, his wife's scream, and the sight of the empty back seat where Lily had been. He shook his head, pushing the memories aside. This time, he wouldn't let hope slip through his fingers. Hours later, William arrived at the small town. It was picturesque, with cobblestone streets and charming homes. But William wasn't here to admire the scenery. He walked with purpose, his eyes scanning every face he passed, searching for a glimmer of familiarity. At the local school, he hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The sound of children laughing echoed through the halls, a bittersweet reminder of the years he had missed with Lily. He approached the front desk, where a kind-looking woman greeted him. "Can I help you, sir? I'm looking for one of your teachers. Her name is Rose." The woman smiled. "Rose is with her students right now, but I can call her if it's urgent." "Please," William said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. A few minutes later, Rose appeared in the hallway, her presence commanding yet gentle. William's breath caught. She was older than Lily would have been, but the resemblance was striking. Her eyes held a warmth that reminded him of his wife, and her smile, though hesitant, felt achingly familiar. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but cautious. William struggled to find the right words. I saw your portrait," he began, his voice faltering. "I believe we might have a connection." Rose tilted her head, her expression a mixture of curiosity and confusion. "I'm not sure I understand. Do you remember anything about your childhood?" he asked gently. "Where you came from, your family?" Her smile faded, replaced by a guarded look. "No, I don't. I've tried, but it's all a blur. Why are you asking?" William hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "Because I believe you might be someone I've been searching for." Rose took a step back, her eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" "My name is William," he said, his voice steady, "and I believe you might be my daughter." The hallway fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. Rose stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away. The air outside was crisp and cold as William stepped out of the school, his mind reeling from the brief encounter. Rose's reaction had been expected, yet it still stung. He had spent 2 decades yearning for this moment, and now, confronted with the possibility that she truly was his daughter, he found himself at a loss for how to proceed. He stood on the steps, gripping the railing as his thoughts raced. How could he convince her to listen? How could he prove what he already felt in his heart? A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Are you all right, sir?" He turned to see the woman from the front desk, watching him with concern. Her warm expression reminded him that he wasn't entirely alone in this journey. "Yes," he replied, though his tone lacked conviction. I need her to believe me." The woman hesitated before stepping closer. "Rose is a wonderful person, but she's also guarded. She's had a difficult life. Whatever you're trying to tell her, it won't be easy for her to accept." William nodded, appreciating the insight. "I don't want to overwhelm her. I just want a chance to explain." The woman studied him for a moment before offering a small smile. "She likes to walk by the lake in the evenings. It's her place to think. Maybe you'll find her there." He thanked her and made his way to the lake, the weight of anticipation settling over him. The walk was long, but it gave him time to reflect. He thought of Lily as a child, her laughter echoing through their home, her tiny arms wrapping around his neck as she called him Daddy. That innocence, that joy, had been ripped away from both of them. And now, after all these years, could fate truly be giving them a second chance? As he approached the lake, the sight of Rose sitting on a bench stopped him in his tracks. She was staring out at the water, her posture tense yet contemplative. For a moment, he simply watched her, his emotions a whirlwind of hope, fear, and longing. Finally, he gathered his courage and walked toward her. The crunch of gravel under his shoes made her glance up, and her expression hardened when she saw him. "I thought I made myself clear," she said, her tone cool. "I don't know you." William raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to pressure you. I just want to talk." Rose sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "What do you want from me?" He took a seat on the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. "I want you to know the truth," he said quietly. "And I want to know if there's any chance you feel it too." "Feel what?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "That connection," he said, meeting her gaze. "That maybe we're not strangers." She looked away, her fingers tightening around the edge of the bench. "I've spent my whole life not knowing where I came from. I've tried to fill in the blanks, but it's like trying to read a book with half the pages missing. And now you show up claiming to have the answers. But how am I supposed to believe you?" William reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small gold bracelet. The delicate chain glinted in the fading sunlight, and Rose's breath hitched as her eyes locked onto it. "This was yours," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You wore it the night of the accident. It has your initials engraved on it, L.M. Rose stared at the bracelet, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she reached out and took it from him, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. She turned it over, tracing the engraving with trembling hands. "I don't remember this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But it feels familiar." "That's because it's yours," William said gently. "I gave it to you on your 5th birthday. You called it your lucky charm." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, her defenses still firmly in place. "This doesn't prove anything," she said, though her voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. "And it's just a bracelet." William nodded, understanding her hesitation. "I know it's not enough." but I'll do whatever it takes to help you remember. I just need you to give me a chance." Rose looked down at the bracelet again, her emotions warring within her. Finally, she stood, clutching the bracelet tightly. "I need time," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I can't do this right now." William rose as well, his heart heavy but filled with a glimmer of hope. "And take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready." She nodded, then turned and walked away, leaving him standing by the lake. He watched her until she disappeared from sight, the weight of the moment settling over him. It wasn't the reunion he had dreamed of, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. The next morning, the town was alive with its usual hum of activity, but William's mind was elsewhere. The encounter at the lake had left him restless. Though Rose hadn't accepted his claim, her reaction to the bracelet was a spark of hope he couldn't ignore. He stood by the window of his hotel room, staring out at the distant horizon, replaying every word she'd said. The way her fingers trembled as she held the bracelet lingered in his thoughts. She felt something, even if she wouldn't admit it yet. Determined to give her space while continuing his search for answers, William decided to visit the orphanage where Rose had reportedly grown up. The dusty records and faded photographs might hold a missing piece of the puzzle. After a quick breakfast, he made his way to the modest brick building on the outskirts of town. It was an unassuming place, its walls weathered by time, but exuding a quiet sense of resilience. An elderly woman greeted him at the door, her kind face framed by wisps of grey hair. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you?" William offered a polite smile. "I'm looking for information about a girl who once lived here. Her name is Rose. I believe she arrived about 20 years ago, after an accident." The woman's eyes softened. "Ah, Rose. She was one of our brightest children. Always so eager to learn, despite everything she'd been through. Do you have any records from that time?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. "Anything that might shed light on her past?" The woman led him to a small office lined with filing cabinets. She opened one of the drawers and began thumbing through the files. After a few moments, she pulled out a thin folder and handed it to William. "This is all we have," she said. "I'm afraid it's not much. Most of what we know came from the authorities who brought her here." William sat at a nearby desk and opened the folder. Inside were sparse notes, the date Rose had arrived, a brief description of her injuries, and a mention of the accident that had left her stranded. His heart clenched as he read the words, "Found alone, no memory of family." Among the papers was a photograph, a small, faded snapshot of a young girl sitting on the steps of the orphanage. Her face was familiar, even in its youthful innocence. William's fingers trembled as he studied the picture, but something else caught his eye. Tucked behind the photograph was a torn piece of paper, yellowed with age. He carefully unfolded it and froze. It was a fragment of a larger photograph, one he recognized instantly. It was part of the family portrait that had been taken just weeks before the accident. The edges of the fragment matched perfectly with the photo he had at home. His breath caught as he stared at it, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. This was hers?" he asked, his voice thick. The woman nodded. "It was found in her pocket when she arrived. She clung to it like a lifeline for weeks. Eventually, she stopped looking at it, but we kept it with her file." William closed his eyes, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. This was the proof he had been searching for, yet it only deepened his sorrow. How had his daughter ended up here, alone and with no memory? And why had it taken him so long to find her? The woman placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "She's been through a lot, but she's strong. If anyone can find her way back to the truth, it's Rose." William nodded, grateful for her kindness. He carefully placed the photograph fragment back in the folder and stood. "Thank you for your help. This means more to me than you know." As he left the orphanage, the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on him. He now had tangible proof that Rose was Lily, but he also understood the delicate nature of the truth. If he rushed her, he could push her further away. He needed to approach her with care, allowing her to come to terms with her past at her own pace. Later that evening, William found himself back at the lake, the same spot where he'd spoken to Rose the night before. The sun was setting, casting golden hues across the water. He didn't expect to see her again so soon, but as fate would have it, she appeared walking slowly along the path. She hadn't noticed him yet, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Rose," he called gently, not wanting to startle her. She stopped and turned, her expression a mixture of surprise and wariness. "You're persistent," she said, though there was no malice in her tone. "I found something," he said, stepping closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "Something that might help you understand." Her brows furrowed. "What is it?" William reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph fragment. He held it out to her, his hand steady despite the storm of emotions within him. "This was found with you when you arrived at the orphanage," he explained. "It's part of a larger photograph, a family portrait, our family portrait." Rose hesitated before taking the fragment from him. She studied it closely, her eyes scanning the faded image. Her fingers traced the edges, as though trying to piece together a memory she couldn't quite grasp. "I don't remember this," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But it feels familiar, like something I should know." "You don't have to remember everything right away," William said softly. "Just take your time. I'm here when you're ready." Rose looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions, confusion, fear, and a flicker of hope. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you for not giving up on me." William's heart swelled with a bittersweet joy. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a step in the right direction. And for now, that was enough. The days that followed were marked by a cautious yet undeniable shift. Rose didn't avoid William as she had before, though their conversations remained measured and brief. She spent hours with the photograph fragment, studying it as if willing it to unlock the memories trapped within her mind. William, careful not to push her, focused on giving her space while quietly savoring each small interaction they shared. One afternoon, as the sun cast a warm glow over the lake, Rose approached William outside his hotel. Her posture was hesitant, but there was a resolve in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I want to see the rest of the photograph," she said, her voice steady. William's heart leaped. He had been waiting for this moment, but had resisted offering the picture outright, knowing she needed to make the decision on her own. He nodded, gesturing for her to follow him inside. In his room, he opened a leather-bound folder and carefully retrieved the full photograph. The image was as vivid as the day it had been taken. William, his wife, and Lily, all smiling against a backdrop of a sunlit garden. He placed the photo on the table and stepped back, giving Rose the space to examine it. She sat down, her fingers trembling as she picked up the photograph. Her gaze lingered on the little girl in the picture, her features a near-perfect match to her own. She touched the image as if it might somehow bring the memory to life. "That's me," she whispered, the words more a question than a statement. "Yes," William said softly. "You were 5 years old. We took this picture a few weeks before the accident." Rose looked up at him, her eyes searching. "Tell me about her." "About me." William sat across from her, his expression tender. "You were the light of our lives. Your mother adored you. She always said you were her greatest gift. You loved to paint and draw, and you had this laugh that could brighten even the darkest day. You were our Lily." The name hung in the air, wrapping around Rose like a blanket. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't look away from the photograph. "Why can't I remember?" "The accident," William said gently. "You were thrown from the car. When they found you, you had no memory of who you were or where you came from. They brought you to the orphanage, and I didn't find you in time." Rose's tears spilled over, and she covered her mouth with her hand, the weight of his words sinking in. I've spent my whole life feeling like something was missing," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know what it was, but it was always there, like a hole I couldn't fill." William leaned forward, his own eyes glistening. "I've felt the same way every day since you disappeared, but now we've found each other, and we can fill that hole together." Rose looked at him, her walls beginning to crumble. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "And I don't know how to be someone's daughter." "You don't have to know," William said. "We'll figure it out together. All I want is a chance to be in your life again." For the first time, Rose smiled, a small, tentative smile, but one that reached her eyes. "Okay," she said softly. "We can try." The next few days were filled with moments of quiet connection. William shared stories of Lily's childhood, showing Rose the drawings she had made, the keepsakes he had held onto all these years. Rose listened intently, her defenses slowly melting as she began to piece together the fragments of her past. One evening, as they walked by the lake, Rose turned to William, her expression contemplative. "Do you ever think about her, Mom?" "Every day," William said. "She was my world, and losing her, it broke me. But having you back, even just for these few days, has given me something I thought I'd never feel again." "What's that?" she asked. "Hope," he replied simply. Rose nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I think she'd be happy for us." "I think so too," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "She'd be proud of the woman you've become." They walked in silence for a while, the unspoken bond between them growing stronger with each step. For the first time in years, William felt whole, as if the shattered pieces of his heart were slowly being put back together. The air was crisp and calm as William and Rose sat on the porch of his hotel that morning, sipping coffee in silence. The tension that had once lingered between them was replaced by a fragile sense of peace, though the journey was far from over. William knew Rose was still grappling with the weight of the revelations, but he admired her resilience. She had shown more courage in the past few days than he could have ever expected. As they sat, a question hung in the air, unspoken but present. Rose finally broke the silence. "What happened after the accident?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "Why couldn't you find me?" William placed his coffee cup down carefully, his eyes clouded with memory. "It was chaos," he began. "The accident happened late at night, in the middle of nowhere. I woke up in the hospital the next morning. Your mother was gone, and you were missing. The authorities searched for days, but there was no trace of you. They thought—" He hesitated, the pain of the memory evident. "They thought you'd been swept away by the river near the crash site." Rose's brow furrowed. "But I wasn't." "No, you weren't," William said, his voice firm. "You were stronger than they gave you credit for. Somehow, you survived and ended up miles away alone and with no memory of who you were. I didn't stop searching, but after months of dead ends, the trail went cold." He leaned back in his chair, his expression heavy. "I never gave up hope. But as the years passed, it became harder to believe I'd find you, seeing that painting. It felt like a miracle." Rose looked down at her hands, the bracelet William had given her glinting in the morning sunlight. She turned it over slowly, the weight of the past settling on her shoulders. "I don't remember any of it," she admitted. "The accident, the river, the orphanage. None of it feels real." "It's okay," William said gently. You don't have to remember everything. What matters is that we're here now. Rose nodded, her gaze distant. But it feels like there's still something missing, she said softly. But like a part of me is still out there waiting to be found. That afternoon, William suggested they visit the crash site. He had avoided it for years, unable to face the memories it held, but now it seemed like the right thing to do. Perhaps being there would help Rose piece together the fragments of her past, or at least bring them both some closure. The drive was quiet, the scenery changing from quaint streets to winding rural roads. Rose stared out of the window, her expression unreadable. William stole glances at her, his heart aching with both hope and apprehension. When they arrived, the scene was eerily still, as though time had paused in that fateful moment. The river flowed quietly, its gentle ripples belying the tragedy that had unfolded there. William parked the car and stepped out, his chest tightening as memories surged forward. Rose followed, her steps hesitant but determined. "This is where it happened," William said, his voice low. The car went off the road, down that embankment. The current was strong that night. By the time help arrived, the car was submerged. Rose walked closer to the riverbank, her eyes scanning the area as though searching for something she couldn't name. She crouched down, running her fingers over the grass and dirt. "It's strange," she said after a moment. "I don't remember being here, but it feels familiar, like a dream I can't quite grasp." William joined her, his presence steady and reassuring. "You were so small," he said softly, "but you were brave. You found a way to survive." Rose stood, turning to face him. "How did I get to the orphanage?" "From what I've pieced together," William said, "someone must have found you wandering and brought you there. They didn't know who you were, and you couldn't tell them." Rose shook her head, her frustration evident. "It's like my mind won't let me remember." "Maybe you're not ready yet," William said. "Memories can be tricky. Sometimes they come back when we least expect them." As they stood by the river, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves around them. Rose closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. For a brief moment, she felt a flicker of something, a faint image, a voice calling her name, the sensation of water rushing around her, but as quickly as it came, it was gone. She opened her eyes, tears brimming. "It's there," she whispered. "Somewhere inside me. It's there." William reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to force it," he said. "Take your time. I'll be here every step of the way." Rose looked at him, her defenses crumbling further. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with sincerity, "for not giving up on me." William smiled, a mixture of sadness and relief in his expression. "I could never give up on you. You're my daughter." As they left the site, the weight of the day lingered, but so did a newfound sense of understanding. They were both scarred by the past, but together they were beginning to heal, and for the first time in years, William felt a glimmer of peace. The days passed slowly, marked by a fragile but growing bond between William and Rose. They spent more time together, their conversations shifting from cautious exchanges to deeper, more meaningful discussions. Each word, each shared memory felt like a step toward rebuilding the connection they had lost. But amidst the progress, William sensed there was still a wall within Rose, a part of her that remained guarded, as if she feared fully embracing the truth. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the horizon with hues of orange and pink, Rose invited William to her modest home. It was a small but cozy space filled with books, plants, and hints of her artistic nature, sketches pinned to the walls, paintbrushes resting in jars, and a faint smell of turpentine lingering in the air. "I thought it was time you saw where I've been living all these years," she said, offering him a seat in the living room. "It's not much, but it's mine." William smiled as he looked around, taking in the warmth of the space. "It's beautiful," he said sincerely. It suits you. Rose set a cup of tea in front of him and sat across the room, her hands wrapped around her own mug. She seemed contemplative, her gaze drifting toward a shelf lined with framed photos. William noticed the pictures were mostly of her students and colleagues, smiling faces that hinted at the life she had built for herself. But there was one photo that caught his attention. It was older, slightly faded, and showed a young Rose standing in front of the orphanage, her expression solemn. "You've come a long way," he said, nodding toward the photo. Rose followed his gaze and smiled faintly. "That was taken not long after I arrived at the orphanage. I was scared, confused, but I learned to adapt. It wasn't easy, but it shaped me." William's chest tightened as he imagined her as a little girl, navigating such a difficult path alone. "Ume, you were stronger than I ever could have been," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could have been there for you." Rose looked at him, her expression softening. "You're here now," she said simply. "That's what matters." The evening progressed with ease, their conversation flowing naturally. William shared more stories about Lily's childhood, while Rose opened up about her experiences growing up at the orphanage and later finding her passion for teaching. They laughed, reminisced, and found comfort in the shared moments. As the night deepened, Rose hesitated before pulling out a small wooden box from a drawer. She placed it on the table between them, her hands trembling slightly. "I've been holding on to this for as long as I can remember," she said quietly. "I don't know why, but I always felt like it was important." William watched as she opened the box, revealing a collection of seemingly random objects, a small seashell, a broken crayon, and a piece of fabric that looked like it had been torn from a dress. Among the items was a tiny charm in the shape of a star. "I used to think these were just things I picked up along the way," Rose continued, her voice distant. "But now, I wonder if they were pieces of my past." William's breath caught as he recognized the star charm. "That was on your bracelet," he said, his voice trembling. "Your mother added it for your 4th birthday. You said it made you feel like a princess." Rose stared at the charm, her eyes wide with disbelief. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. The shell reminded her of a family trip to the beach she had dreamed about for years. The crayon evoked a memory of coloring at a small wooden table, and the fabric sparked an image of her mother's favorite dress. "I remember," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I remember her smile. I remember the way she used to hum when she cooked. I remember you, holding me on your shoulders at the park." William reached for her hands, his own tears falling freely. It's all coming back," he said, his voice filled with awe. "You're remembering who you are." Rose clung to the charm, her emotions pouring out like a floodgate had been opened. "I didn't think I'd ever get this back," she said. "But it's all here, isn't it? The pieces were always here." William nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and relief. "You've always had it in you, Rose, Lily. You just needed time to find it again." For the first time, Rose embraced him fully, letting go of the walls she had built to protect herself. In his arms, she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she was missing. And for William, holding his daughter again after so many years felt like a miracle, a gift he would never take for granted. As the night drew to a close, Rose walked him to the door, her expression serene but thoughtful. "This doesn't erase everything," she said. "There's still so much to process, so much I need to figure out." "I know," William said, his tone understanding. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." She smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that lit up her face. "Thank you, Dad," she said softly, the word carrying more weight than either of them had anticipated. William's eyes filled with tears as he nodded. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As he walked away, the weight of the years lifted from his shoulders. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was a road they would walk together, one step at a time. The morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of day that carried a sense of renewal and hope. William sat at a small cafe near the center of town, his coffee growing cold as he replayed the events of the night before. Rose's words, "Thank you, Dad," echoed in his mind, filling him with a mixture of joy and melancholy. It was the first time she had called him that, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, it was a moment he would treasure forever. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a message on his phone. It was from Rose. "Can we meet at the lake this afternoon? There's something I want to talk about." The simplicity of the message masked the weight it carried. William's heart quickened as he typed a response. "Of course. I'll be there." The hours dragged on until it was time to meet. When William arrived at the lake, Rose was already there, sitting on the same bench where they had first spoken. She seemed deep in thought, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He approached cautiously, not wanting to disrupt her contemplation. "Rose," he said gently as he sat beside her. She turned to him with a small smile, though her eyes betrayed a mix of emotions. "Thanks for coming. Always," he replied. "What's on your mind?" Rose took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the water. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about us, about my past, about the future. It's overwhelming, but it's also freeing." William nodded, allowing her to take her time. He could sense the weight of her words, the vulnerability in her voice. "And I spent so many years wondering who I was," she continued. "I thought if I could just figure it out, I'd finally feel whole. But now that I'm starting to remember, I realize it's not just about knowing who I was, it's about deciding who I want to be." William's chest tightened with pride. "That's a powerful realization," he said, "and you don't have to face it alone." Rose glanced at him, her expression softening. "I know. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about. I want us to move forward, not just as father and daughter, but as family." William's breath caught. The word family carried a significance he hadn't dared to hope for. "Rose, I can't tell you how much that means to me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She smiled, though tears glistened in her eyes. "There's something else," she said, her tone hesitant. "I've been thinking about visiting the orphanage again. I feel like I need to go back one more time, to thank the people who took care of me and to say goodbye to that chapter of my life." William reached out, placing a hand over hers. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said, "and if you'd like, I'd be honored to go with you." Rose hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "I think it's something we should do together." The following morning, they made the trip to the orphanage. The building looked the same as it had during William's first visit, modest and unassuming, yet imbued with a sense of resilience. Rose's steps were steady but slow as they approached the entrance, her emotions clearly swirling beneath the surface. The elderly woman who had helped William greeted them warmly. "Rose," she said with a smile. "Oh, it's so good to see you again, and I see you've brought someone special." Rose returned the smile, her eyes shining. "This is William," she said, "my father." The woman's face lit up with understanding. "Well, it's about time," she said with a chuckle. "Come in, both of you." Inside, Rose was greeted with hugs and kind words from the staff who had cared for her as a child. They shared stories of her time at the orphanage, their words painting a picture of a resilient and spirited young girl. William listened intently, his heart swelling with both pride and sorrow for the years he had missed. As they toured the building, Rose paused in front of a small room filled with books and art supplies. "This was my favorite place," she said softly. I used to sit here for hours, drawing and imagining a different life. William stepped closer, his voice gentle. You created beauty, even in the hardest times. That says so much about who you are. Rose smiled, her eyes glistening. I think I learned it from Mom, she said. She always found a way to make things beautiful. William placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch reassuring. She'd be so proud of you, he said. And I know I am. As they left the orphanage later that day, Rose seemed lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from her. She looked at William with a newfound sense of clarity and determination. I'm ready, she said simply. Ready for what? He asked. To start over, she replied. To embrace the life I've found and the memories I'm rediscovering. To move forward with you. William's heart swelled with gratitude. Then let's do it, he said. Together. The drive back to town was filled with laughter and conversation, the bond between them stronger than ever. For the first time in years, both William and Rose felt a sense of peace and purpose, knowing that their journey, though not without its challenges, was leading them toward a brighter future. The morning air carried a sense of anticipation as William and Rose sat together on the terrace of a cafe, enjoying a quiet breakfast. It had been a week since their visit to the orphanage, and in that time their relationship had deepened in ways neither of them had imagined possible. The days were filled with shared meals, stories, and plans for the future, but William could sense there was still one piece of the puzzle weighing on Rose's mind. Are you sure you're ready for today? He asked gently, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Rose looked up from her coffee, her expression thoughtful but resolute. I am, she said. I need to see the painting again. William nodded, understanding the significance of her request. The painting had been the catalyst for everything, the spark that had reignited a hope he had buried long ago. For Rose, it was more than just a portrait. It was a mirror reflecting the fragments of her identity that she was still piecing together. Later that morning, they arrived at the gallery where William had first encountered the painting. The space was quiet, the soft hum of classical music creating an atmosphere of calm. Michael, the artist who had painted Rose, greeted them with a warm smile. Rose, he said, his voice tinged with surprise. It's good to see you again. Rose returned the smile, though her nerves were evident. I needed to see it, she said simply. Michael nodded and led them to a private room where the painting was displayed. As they entered, Rose froze, her gaze locking onto the canvas. The woman in the portrait stared back at her, her features hauntingly familiar. Rose stepped closer, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the edge of the frame. It's like looking at a version of myself I didn't know existed, she murmured, her voice barely audible. William stood beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. This is where it all started, he said softly. The moment I saw this painting, I knew there was something extraordinary about you. Rose turned to Michael, her expression a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. Why did you choose me as your subject? She asked. Michael hesitated, his eyes darting to William before returning to Rose. You stood out, he said finally. There was something about you, an air of mystery, like you were carrying a story no one else could tell. I didn't know what it was, but I felt compelled to capture it. Rose nodded, absorbing his words. You were right, she said quietly. I just didn't know it at the time. As she continued to study the painting, something shifted in her expression. A subtle change that William recognized as the moment a revelation was about to surface. And I remember this, she said suddenly, her voice trembling with emotion. The photo you used, it was mine. I carried it everywhere when I was a child, even though I didn't know where it came from. I held onto it like it was the only thing keeping me connected to something bigger. Michael nodded, confirming her realization. You gave me the photo, he said. You said it was the only picture you had of yourself as a little girl. Rose's eyes filled with tears as she turned to William. "It was the photo from our family portrait, wasn't it?" William nodded, his own eyes glistening. "Yes," he said. "It was torn, but it was enough to bring us back together." The weight of the moment settled over them, and for the first time, Rose seemed to fully accept the truth of her identity. The doubts and fears that had lingered were replaced by a quiet certainty, a sense of belonging she had spent her entire life searching for. As they left the gallery, Rose reached for William's hand, her grip firm and steady. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with sincerity, "for never giving up on me." William smiled, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "You're my daughter," he said simply. "I could never give up on you." They walked in silence for a while, the connection between them stronger than ever. Rose's steps were lighter, her posture more assured. She was no longer the woman burdened by questions of who she was. She was Lily, a daughter, a survivor, and a woman ready to embrace her future. That evening, back at Rose's home, they shared a quiet dinner. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the kind of warmth that comes from a bond forged through adversity. As they sat together, Rose looked across the table at William, her expression contemplative. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said earlier, about this being where it all started." William raised an eyebrow, curious. "What about it?" "I think it's more than that," she said. "This isn't just where it started, it's where everything changed. For both of us." William nodded, his heart full. "You're right," he said, "and I wouldn't change a thing." As the night wore on, they sat together on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one. The journey that had brought them to this moment had been long and painful, but it had also been filled with moments of grace and redemption. And as they sat side by side, their hearts full of hope, they knew that the road ahead would be one they would walk together. The morning was still as the first rays of sunlight streamed through Rose's living room window. William sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, watching as Rose moved about the room, her movements deliberate yet relaxed. Today felt different, lighter, as if the weight of the past had finally begun to lift. It was a day neither of them had expected to come, and yet here they were, father and daughter, reunited after 20 years. "Are you sure about this?" William asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Rose looked over her shoulder, a small smile on her lips. "I am," she said confidently. "It's time to take the next step." That next step was visiting the house where Rose had grown up, the house she hadn't seen since the day of the accident. William had kept it exactly as it was, unable to part with the memories it held. Now, after weeks of reconnecting, Rose had asked to see it, wanting to face the remnants of her past head-on. The drive to the house was quiet, but filled with anticipation. William glanced at Rose occasionally, searching for any sign of hesitation, but she seemed calm, her gaze fixed on the horizon. When they pulled up to the long driveway, a soft gasp escaped her lips. The house stood tall and proud, surrounded by sprawling gardens that had once been filled with laughter and life. Rose stepped out of the car, her breath catching as memories began to stir. She walked slowly toward the front door, her hand brushing against the flowers lining the path, her eyes scanning every detail. "It's exactly how I remember it," she whispered. William smiled as he unlocked the door. "I couldn't bring myself to change it. It always felt like a part of you was still here." As they stepped inside, the familiar scent of wood and lavender greeted them. Rose paused in the foyer, her eyes landing on a framed photo of the three of them, William, her mother, and a younger version of herself, smiling brightly in the garden. She picked up the photo, her fingers trembling as she traced the edges. "We looked so happy," she said softly. "We were," William said, his voice filled with warmth. "And we can be again," Rose nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. She set the photo back on the table and moved through the house, each room unlocking a new memory. The living room brought flashes of her mother reading to her by the fireplace. The kitchen echoed with the sound of shared meals and laughter, and her bedroom upstairs was a time capsule of her childhood. A small bed, shelves lined with books, and walls adorned with her early artwork. "This was my sanctuary," she said, standing in the doorway of her room. "I used to spend hours in here, dreaming about the future." William joined her, his gaze soft. "You had such a vivid imagination. Your mother and I used to joke that you'd become an artist or a writer." Rose smiled, her tears falling freely now. "I guess I became a little of both." As they continued to explore, Rose felt the pieces of her past falling into place. The house wasn't just a building, it was a home, filled with love and memories she had thought were lost forever. By the time they returned to the living room, a sense of closure had settled over her. "I understand now," she said, looking at William. "This isn't just about remembering who I was. It's about embracing all the parts of me, who I was, who I've become, and who I want to be." William's heart swelled with pride. "And who do you want to be?" he asked gently. Rose smiled, her expression serene. "Your daughter," she said simply. "That's the part of me I'm ready to embrace the most." They sat together on the couch, the sunlight streaming through the windows, casting a warm glow around them. For the first time in years, William felt truly at peace, knowing that the family he had lost was finally whole again. That evening, they stood in the garden, the scent of blooming flowers filling the air. William handed Rose a small box, his hands steady despite the emotions swirling within him. "What's this?" she asked, her brow furrowed in curiosity. "Open it," he said with a smile. Rose lifted the lid to reveal a delicate gold necklace with a star-shaped charm, the same design as the one from her childhood bracelet. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at him. "I thought it was time for a new lucky charm," he said. "A reminder that no matter what, you'll always have a piece of us with you." Rose clasped the necklace in her hands, her voice breaking as she spoke. "It's perfect. Thank you." William helped her fasten it around her neck, his hands steady despite the lump in his throat. As the charm rested against her skin, it felt like a symbol of their journey, a testament to the love that had endured despite the years and the distance. They stood side by side, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The past no longer felt like a burden, but a bridge that had brought them to this moment. And as the stars began to emerge, twinkling like promises of a brighter future, they knew that their story was just beginning. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends.